Welcome to another episode of the DemystifySci podcast. Today we are talking economics with the Program Director for Behavioral Economics at the University of Technology, Sydney, Jason Collins. He blogs at jasoncollins.blog, and I came across him when he wrote an article for Works in Progress magazine about issues with behavioral economics. Namely, that the way that we treat human cognition is as a system that has a myriad of ways in which it can break. As of last count, I think that there's something like 200 different cognitive biases. And Jason's idea is that perhaps it's not that cognition is broken, perhaps our model for what human cognition looks like is broken. And we definitely talk about that during the conversation, but we talk about so much more than that. We talk about the goal of economics as a discipline. We talk about what it is that the world will look like, if it's possible to predict. What's the
role of nudging people into certain decision-making cascades? What does the concept of growth really mean? Have we perhaps misconceived of the idea of growth? Because we generally think of it in terms of dollars and cents, but if you start to factor in psychological benefits, right? Mental health, well-being, happiness, whatever that even means, we'll play with it. Can you come up with an economic model that actually provides for a more humane, human-centered world of the future? And so we're going into all of that today.
And it's particularly interesting, I think, for this project, which is traditionally a more science-centered project, because we don't live in a world that is purely scientific. Like it or not, we live in a world where there are many other forces that are pulling on us. And when we try to undertake projects as big as changing the face of the way that humans conceive of themselves in nature, you can't just rely on the science alone. You have to understand all of these other disciplines that fold into the project. And so it was a real joy to get Jason's perspective on it, and we hope that you'll enjoy it. We think you will.
You will for sure. So go ahead and share it with somebody if you do enjoy it. And if you've already done that, tell us what you think, leave a comment, but consider becoming a patron. We're trying to grow this project into something much bigger than just a podcast eventually. We really want to get to the point where we can actually give grants to different thinkers who might not be appropriately matched to an academic position. So, we're going to build this into all sorts of different departments. And if you want to, and you have the means to support us with a tiny little donation every month, they really stack up over time, and we love our patrons so freaking much. We meet with you guys every week, and it is completely invaluable to what we're trying to accomplish here.
And I think I say this when we go to our weekly patron chats, but it is one of the highlights of my week, because we live in the middle of nowhere. Most of my friends are not interested in scientific or technical questions in the same way. They're generally more interested in philosophical questions. And so this is one of the only places that I've found where there is a high level of interest and rigor in thinking about the world. And it is an amazing, amazing event that we have every single week, that just the more that we can grow it, we'll have to figure out how to handle it differently as it gets bigger, because right now it's 10 people. But I think that it's going to grow into its own incredible piece of this project. And so if you want to get in on the ground floor, get in now. And if not, that's cool too. We love having you around just to listen.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
One of my bigger roles is I'm program director for a new Master of Behavioral Economics here at UTS. And this year we have the last tranche of new subjects coming online, and I'm taking a couple of those. And so, yes, I've been doing the preparation for those. And there's some really interesting subjects. So one, in some ways, it's not quite what you call a capstone subject, but sort of a final subject which ties a lot of things together, where we're going to spend 12 weeks just picking up interesting papers from the world of behavioral economics. Each week we'll pick one paper and as a group tear it apart, understand what's going on, how it works, where it fits in the world.
What is that, by the way? What is behavioral, like what separates behavioral economics from traditional economics? That's a hard word for me today for some reason. What's the separation point there?
So I think about going back to the origins of economics. So economics, in some ways, tries to come up with stylized models of how humans make economic decisions, and to do that and to really put it into a mathematical format, there's a range of assumptions or axioms that it's built upon. So they'll say, well, when humans are making decisions, they'll do things such as they'll have complete preferences. So they'll whatever choice they're given, they'll be able to make a decision. They'll never get stuck. Or they'll have transitive preferences. So if they prefer A to B and B to C, then they'll prefer A to C. So there's a whole raft of assumptions they're built on. And you're probably already, when you listen to what I say there, you're going, hang on, I can think of maybe there might be exceptions to that. Complete preferences. There's probably times you look at a choice and go, I'm stumped.
Totally, most of the time. I mean, for some people more than others, right? You can get completely pathological at some point where you just can't do anything.
Yeah. You just, and it's not a case of like you need more information. It's just there's something in your gut that can't make you decide. And so what behavioral economics really is taking some of those assumptions, going, well, let's actually try and make them a little bit more realistic. What happens if we actually change that to how humans really make decisions, and then do that modeling exercise, that analysis of human behavior and economic systems with a new set of more realistic assumptions. And when you do that, you suddenly find, hang on, we might expect to see different phenomena emerge. And that's really what behavioral economics is about, weakening, changing those assumptions, still using the economic frameworks, but with a more realistic view of human behavior. So slow
it down for me. Like how did we originally think about economics? Just in terms of humans have this one central need, which is some X, and then we're going to tailor all of our financial decision making to match that.
Were human needs even part of the calculation, or human? Because I feel like the way that I see it, behavioral economics includes the internal state of the people inside the system in a way that early theories of economics didn't really bother with. Is that accurate?
Like early economics was black and white in a way that this is more like Kodachrome or something?
Yeah, or maybe it's a little bit richer than that, the history. So you go right back to the beginning. You go back to, I suppose, Adam Smith, and some people would label sort of economics beginning there with the Wealth of Nations. And he actually had a really rich sort of view of human nature. So we wrote another book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. So it was really about, in some ways, that was trying to explore this richness of what people want and the ideas that they really care about, what other people think and respect and standing and so on. But then what happened is as economics became more formalized, and now we're sort of getting us in the 1930s, 1940s, then when you try and formalize it and give it a mathematical structure, suddenly then you need to be a bit more specific. And I guess some of the richness maybe got lost there.
Interesting.
And not
so were those guys weren't writing in mathematical terms. They were more conceptually oriented, like philosophically speaking, or?
Yeah, exactly. Well, Adam Smith, he's as much a philosopher as an economist, you'd say. So, and much of what he was writing was in response to other philosophers. So, yeah, and in his books there is no mathematics. There's no attempt to write a mathematical model as such. Whereas, economics now, like nearly everything that you teach and talk about in an economic course, there'll be some mathematization of what you're talking about, which is sometimes really powerful. It's really useful sometimes, but
it's easy to judge if they're right or wrong. I guess that's the nice thing about math. There's always an output, right? I was
going to say that it creates an illusion of certainty also, maybe, where if you have an equation where you're like, this is the equation that governs these conditions, and people apply it, it might give you the sense that you understand how it works better than you actually do. Do you get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I think I do. Like, there's this subtle danger of taking your assumptions a little bit too seriously and what's coming out of it, because you quiz an economist about the axioms that underpin their work, and they'll always say, they're simplifications, they're often wrong, but they're powerful tools. And yet every now and then when you come to apply it, though, they seem to forget that. And one that I'm often a big, I guess, critical to or complain about a lot is, because you need to say what do people want, and a really easy thing to say what people want is financial. You put it into dollar terms, and And everyone will say, yeah, everyone will agree. Any economist would say, yes, we don't only want money. But then I think people kind of forget that when they're then doing the exercise and maybe doing policy analysis, and they seem to, make recommendations almost as though that is what people really want. That's the only thing that they care about.
Well, it seems like we're operating, again, I'm going to say a lot of things probably over the course of this conversation where you are please more than welcome to be like, no, that's completely wrong. That's not how people see it. But from the outside, it seems like when you talk economics, you don't have a framework for being able to apply much except for dollar amounts.
No, I think that's actually probably is one point where we disagree, because you can actually, in the economic frameworks, you could have what we call preferences. That's really the language of economists. What do we prefer when we're making a decision? But you can have preferences over anything. So you could have preferences for for simply your social status, preferences for what others get. You could have all of that. It could all be built in, but just by practice and ease, it tends not to be. So so it's not a case of the economic framework is a constraint there, but the way we maybe use it tends to be more the constraint. It's just very easy to always fall back on the dollar term. If you're running an experiment with students, it's just easy to get dollars and have them make decisions over dollars, and then go in the end, okay, here's their preferences around these different, say, gambles or whatever the exercise is. It's much harder to put it into a different into a different set of, I suppose, objectives. Well,
okay, so that's true. And I see what you're saying, but I wonder if at the next level, where if economics as a discipline is pursued largely in service of an advisory capacity to industry and governments, then the incentive structure there is for the discipline to produce actionable directives that lead to an increase in the bottom line, in revenue, in GDP. And so the preferences of the people might be theoretically present in the discipline of economics, but in the application of it, is there capacity for dealing with that, or are people more preoccupied with just the financial incentives?
I'd say maybe it's a mix. So one thing that economists really love doing is, even if something's not necessarily financial, is giving it a dollar sum. So back in my past life, so I'm only recently an academic, and I spent a lot of time in consulting in economics. We did cost-benefit analysis. And when you're doing cost-benefit analysis, quite often what you have is you do have intangible things. People's time is a classic one. What is the value of someone's time? But when I say value, like the value that people look for is a dollar value. They might sometimes they even try to get to more nebulous ideas. So, just try and understand just whether someone, in fact, maybe I can tell you a little story here, which might help flesh this out a bit. So there's been a lot of work over recent decades to try and get people to consume less energy. And so what they'll do is, they'll come all sorts of ways of communicating with these people. So going, hey, how can we get them to simply conserve energy in their home, maybe install insulation, whatever it might be. And one of the really cool ways that behavioral economists found to do that was to compare their energy usage to the neighbor. So provide on their bill, it might say, here's your energy usage, and your neighbor uses this much, and you're using 20% more. And there might be a frowny face if you're using a lot of energy, whatever it might be. And people tend to adjust their energy usage based on that. So they, so when they see that their neighbor's using less energy than them, they tend to go down a bit. And perversely, if they see their neighbor's using a bit more, they might actually go up a little bit. So we look to cues for what other people are doing to work out what our own best actions are. We tend to want to be normal. We want to be like other people. So, and then when they go to assess whether that's effective, they'll simply go, well, how much money did these people save? And so there's the really cold-hearted sort of economic analysis. Did we save money? Maybe you can even get some value for the reduced greenhouse gas emissions.
Like compared to the past or something? Like compared to the prior to the implementation of this metric?
Well, quite often what they do is they'll do a randomized control trial. So some people would get that message, other people wouldn't. And by randomization, they'll assume those two groups are roughly the same and compare those two groups. So that's how they'll try and tease out causation there. Now, the thing that's really interesting to me about this is, of course, when you get compared to your neighbor, it's not simply a piece of information that you then act upon. It actually might create an emotional reaction. You might go, oh, geez, am I a bad person? It might actually make them feel worse. And so this tool of using what we call social norms or social comparisons is really pervasive now. It's used to try and get people to pay their tax, that kind of thing. But from a dollar perspective, it's been really successful. But then from, say, a mental health perspective, from the perspective of how those people feel, it could actually be having a negative drag. And so the question then is, well, should we include that in our cost-benefit analysis to see whether or not this is a good thing? And so there's one paper, and I always forget the authors of that paper every time I talk about this, and I've forgotten it again now, but where what they did is actually simply went to the people and said, how much would you be willing to pay for this information? So this is one, again, economists' favorite way of trying to work out, trying to give a dollar value to the intangibles. But they'll say, how much are you willing to pay to be compared to your neighbor? So then you can work out how much energy you want to use. And in that work, about a third of people are willing to pay to not receive that information. So it's such a drag on them. They're willing to hand over money so they don't get compared, don't know where they stand to the neighbors. And there you're starting to get, still in dollar terms, but a little bit closer to capturing the fuller, I guess, cost or value, whatever you want to, or utility of providing that information to them.
Gosh,
so yeah,
it's so interesting. It's just like that's such a toxic narrative that's pervasive in our society, which I feel like is completely unintentional. It's just this idea that mankind is sort of this parasite, that is kind of sucking the earth dry or something like that. And I think it's a little bit misguided, and I think that's what people are reacting to intuitively. Is everywhere they look, they're being told to do a better job at their consumerist life, and it's not easy, especially for people in the developing world and so forth. That's quite a god to bow to.
I mean, it's not surprising to me that people don't want to have to think about how they compare to their neighbors, because they probably already spend a lot of time considering that in other ways, right? Do I have is my car fancy enough? Is my lawn as nice? Is my house as nice? And so when you start to add layers of, well, am I performing the moral structures of what is expected of me as well as my neighbors? That's almost too much to bear.
Yeah, indeed. It's and ultimately this question here is like, well, yeah, how much of, as, say, economists, like, obviously we should be thinking about that in terms of our models, in terms of explaining behavior and understanding it. And it's quite often it's absent. But then, as policymakers, it's a much more sticky territory. Like, is that something, is that a lever we should feel comfortable using, either adding to it or not? Or is it even something we could help out? Like, if people feel better not knowing they're bad people, but for want of a better word,
it's sad that it makes them feel like bad people, though, because in some sense I feel like it's taking responsibility off of the big power players as well, right? I mean, consumer energy costs are probably, at least matched by industrial capacity. It probably outweighed heavily. I don't actually know anything detailed about that, but it's interesting that some of the, who's the biggest spender of energy? At least in our country, it's the military, for sure, by far.
Yeah.
And they're the largest generators of waste too. And so I feel like it's misleading, but it feeds into people's need to do the right thing. But it's also sort of distracting from perhaps the bigger players.
Well, I mean, I think that the question at the heart of that is, it seems like if you are adding these metrics for telling people how they are relative to their neighbors in order to nudge them towards a behavior that you want them to perform, who sets the behavior? Who sets the behavioral norms? Is it the economists themselves that look around and they're like, this is what's necessary in favor of a stable state? Or who's deciding this?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting question. But there's probably multiple, a bunch of different sources. So, right now there is actually a big political press around, say, reduced emissions, and then of course when you come to economists and go, what can we do? They'll pull out a couple of tools, and in fact, economists will tend to pull out two sets of tools. There's a very traditional economic tool set, and they'll say, well, charge these people more, raise prices. Prices are a pretty amazing lever for changing behavior. And then the behavioral economists, they'll start to suggest things such as social norms. There's other ideas that are floating around. But it's probably, pretty then in some ways bounces back, because take, for example, that idea of comparing to neighbors, social norm comparison, because that's been seen to be successful in quite a few domains. Now that's in some ways a tool with its own life. So everyone, all these governments around the world are going, how can I pick that up and apply it? And the comparison with neighbours around or others around tax returns and tax payments is a really big one. So I think most countries now seem to have a program where they'll send out a notice going 90% of your neighbours, either, or depending which country, either pay their tax on time if they're trying to get people at least to do it on time, or if they're trying to get people to pay their tax at all, it might be, say, 90% of your neighbours or people in your area pay their tax. And it's just it's a tool where it gets rolled out anyway, because people go, hang on, I can get more money here. Simply, I guess, a great revenue raising or tactic for a government who wants a bit more cash.
It's really interesting. I love the idea of incorporating something along the lines of morality back into our decision making. That seems really promising. I was teaching a class this morning at the university, like a very basic intro astronomy course. And today I had a little extra time, so I explored how the ancient peoples thought about the stars. And it turns out that, they didn't view the stars just as these material objects that were undergoing various atomic processes, right? Which is obviously kind of where our technological minds go. But they used the stars to tell stories that reflected the way that they thought people should behave with one another. And so the whole society and the science and the cosmos to them incorporated all of these other moral levels to decision making. And it worries me that has gotten swept away in our pursuit of growth and our pursuit of technological progress and all of these great things, because those seem to be as much a real force in the world as anything else. The moral behaviors, how to treat one another, how to behave in conflicts, and so forth. And do you feel like behavioral economics is in some ways attempting to integrate those other processes? Is that the role of considering mental health? Like, is mental health the new spirit?
Maybe. So I think behavioral economics probably, and this is actually one of my points of critique about behavioral economics, it really is built on the old economics foundations. So it takes some of those basic assumptions, axioms, and then adds in a degree of psychological realism to them. So it is actually still quite rare that you'll see a behavioral economic analysis that really grapples with outcomes beyond either a simple behavior they're targeting or, say, some measure of consumer benefit in dollars. You can find it. You can find academic debates about, should you even be nudging? What about autonomy? Like, is there any value to giving, allowing people to make decisions without us being these, puppets behind the scene, puppet masters behind the scenes? But it's probably on the edge. As in the world of applied behavioral economics, it's just very much a what's our target? What's our toolkit? Based on this, our understanding of some of these anomalies from standard economic theory, and then how do we change this behavior? If the target's vaccination, simply how to get more people vaccinated. If it's energy saving, how to get more people to save energy, and that broader analysis of all the costs and benefits and the system-wide effects still doesn't tend to get considered to the extent that to the extent it might be nice to do or at least contemplate as part of our conversation as to whether we're delivering whether we're doing good.
Yeah, but it sounds like what you're saying is that people will pay for you to improve their mental health, something like that. Or that there's some economic value in improving people's, there's potentially an extractable value from improving people's mental health. And I feel like mental health is as close as we get. Like, I don't know, I would make the supposition that most mental health issues that are common anyways result from some struggle with a moral existence on Earth, right? It's to seek people whose lives have been through traumatic processes who haven't been able to repair them, and they're trying to find a place in a world that doesn't necessarily seem to have a place for them.
But what I want to say to that is probably an accurate model of the world. But I feel like economics is not a discipline of the people as much as it is a discipline of the state, right? Like, there's an element of top-down statecraft that's associated with economics, because it's not like people. It feels like a discipline that is developed in order to help governments become stable and solvent and to reach their people and have them do stuff.
You have you want them to get a vaccine or you want them to save energy. And
But that's a state level decision.
And they're particularly motivated, interestingly motivated. Like, what are the motivations behind those? And I agree with you that they seem deeply tied to statecrafting and
exactly.
market stability for big market players.
Yeah, and so it's like, is economics fundamentally a discipline of the state?
I'm not sure I'd say that. Because I suppose because there's a pretty big body of economists, of course, who would in some ways say, understanding of what they say maximizes well-being and wealth is actually in some ways the absence of the state. It's around allowing markets to play out. It's allowing sort of individual decision makers. In fact, going back to Adam Smith, through their selfishness, leading to the benefits we get. I think I never get the quote exactly right, but Smith says it's from the fact that people are pursuing their own ends that we get our bread or our or whatever else that we want that actually allows us to benefit. So on one level, I'd say, like, as a discipline as a whole, I wouldn't label as something that that's all about the state. But of course, as a state, you look at economics and the toolkit that it provides, and it's a pretty attractive toolkit to pick up. And it's economics has been very influential in policy development. So at least theoretically, nearly every policy now is supposed to go through a cost-benefit analysis. It's supposed to be put under the microscope of economic frameworks to see whether or not it should be done. Now, whether that actually happens or not, and to what extent that itself as a political process is a pretty interesting question. But at least they're looking at going, here's a whole bunch of tools I have to achieve my needs, what I need to do as a state, and I'm going to pick it up and use it.
Yeah, because like at an individual level, if people just did what they wanted, then you wouldn't have the problem of we need to get people to take vaccines or we need people to moderate their energy consumption, right? Because people are just going to be buying Hummers or doing whatever they want. So there is like some sort of narrative nudging that goes on with this, right? That that's tied into national level interests or industrial level interests. I mean, I don't know if you can even separate the two out. I guess is kind of what I'm getting at, And I see it as like a grand project of our civilization to find a way to incorporate the human values back into into
the nudges that are being made.
Right, the industrially driven nudges that are being made that are making everybody money and making our lives comfortable, but perhaps we're sacrificing a future while we're doing some of those things. Yeah,
so kind of to try to wear maybe two hats briefly. Like so your economist response, like your traditional economist response to that would be, in some ways, that building of wealth and so on pretty gives us a degree of freedom to pursue our own wants and needs and meet them to an extent never available before. So that would be a pretty quick response, with amazingly low child mortality and longevity and all that kind of stuff that comes with being a developed society.
And comfort, right? Just pure comfort.
Yeah, indeed. Look at those chairs.
Right.
It's fantastic.
$20 at Goodwill, actually. But we're hungry for comfort, of course. Yeah, this drives so much. Yeah, sorry, keep going.
Give me convenience or give me death. Yeah.
But also comfort, as we all know from the oldest fables, that you can really find yourself down in a hole if you pursue comfort to the bottom of the earth.
Yeah, is that what we really want to? Like, I suppose again, this is well into the realm of philosophy, and I'm a terrible philosopher, but what is it said for having struggle in life, for objectives beyond just that ease? I think most of us would say, actually, no, we want much more than that. Is the modern society the best place to pursue that, where it's fulfilled to the maximum degree? So that's pretty interesting.
I mean, can economics help with that? Can economics? Is there a potential way to build in those kind of? It sounded like there was a hint of it with the psychological valuation, but does economics have a role in building a future that incorporates human values?
I think that what the larger question that I see that as fitting into is there something beyond growth on a global level? Would you agree with that? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Yeah.
Beyond, I mean, growth is confused term, but obviously comfort, right? I mean, this comes down to quality of life. We have this amazing standard of living in the developed world, right? And certainly we do. Everything is, that's generally what all of our work goes into, is making a very comfortable life for ourselves, our families. It's way beyond survival and security at this point, which is obviously what all of the economic arts, I'm sure, were intended, was to ensure survival in the original place, right? I mean, people were dying by the hordes until very recently from starvation and poverty, and this isn't so much the issue anymore. But yeah, is there any way for economics to tamp down that mono-value fascination with growth and
well, I think it's certainly sometimes so. Maybe one thing, I definitely need to be careful with this, is like some ways trying to ascribe like a motivation or a purpose to economics. Ultimately, economics it's a toolkit for looking at human behavior. Again, what happens when humans make economic decisions? What system level effects there are from us making these decisions under scarcity? So in that sense, like no matter what we're trying to achieve, economics could provide at least one framework for thinking about it and looking at it. Now, I'd say most economists, and to be honest, I probably agree with to a degree, would actually say growth is a pretty amazing thing, in at least in terms of then giving us the freedom to perhaps think about those things. But if ultimately you went actually, I suppose, I guess again a bigger societal philosophical discussion or whatever that discussion is, when actually we think here is, we think a degrowth agenda is right, whatever it might be. The economists would be, people could go, well, here's the costs and benefits of that, at least from one measure, and you might be able to then say, okay, given what you're saying, is that something we're willing to accept? Is that, does that extra information you're providing from your way of looking at things something that I guess changes our mind or leads us to be comfortable? Because I think one of the really interesting things about say a degrowth agenda would be, does it have costs, like in terms of costs about ability to provide healthcare, or does it have costs in terms of, I guess, those less developed countries that are still coming out? And that's the sort of thing where maybe it could all, maybe with the right systems it could work, but I think economic framework could actually be quite useful in at least one set of tools to think about it.
Well, so, okay, I want to lay down the two sides of this, which is growth versus degrowth. And these are pretty entrenched positions that people pick one or the other, right? And it seems like the real question is, if we are on a planet with finite resources, is it possible to continue growing eternally and have that be the benchmark for how we establish what is working and what is not? Do you think that that's an accurate reflection of the debate?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think I certainly there is a limit. Like if you simply extrapolate current processes actually not that far into the future, you go, hang on, there's not enough atoms in the universe to actually have that endless growth. So yeah, I think undoubtedly there's a limit. Probably two questions that come to my mind here is like, one, just how far is that limit? Like how much more is there before we need to worry about, or just how much straight benefit is there for, say, bringing people out of poverty and so on, that we can get before that becomes a limit we hit? The other thing, which for me is a really important thing about growth, is, and this is getting to the economist, in some ways, technical definition, but it's really about economic growth or technological progress. Sort of is really about doing more with less. And so to the extent that you're using the same amount of resources, but getting more output from it, whatever that is, that's actually the heart of growth. So you can actually see, there is there's a possibility, say, of having reduced resource use and yet having increased output from it. And that is actually, in some ways, the true definition of technological progress that an economist would normally hang their hat on. It's not using more resources is not in itself is not growth. That's just more input. True growth is that, I guess it's like increased productivity from what finite resources you have. So that technological progress, actually probably is a vital thing to be thinking about, ultimately reducing the growth in what we're exploiting or extracting from Earth.
And the reason that people are worried about a degrowth mindset is that it would stunt technological progress? Because I know that it's people seem to have broken up into two schools, those that are pro-growth and those that are against growth. And
Yes.
superficially, by the definition that you've just given, which is that it's the ability to do more from less, which is actually the title of, I think it's Andrew McAfee's book. He wrote, he basically wrote an entire treatise called More from Less, which is that, look, it's not a crisis in the way that we perceive it, because all of the predictions that were made in the 1970s by the limits to growth have not panned out, because the hallmark of our society has been that we figure out how to produce more from fewer and fewer units of raw input.
There's something else that's really interesting here too, which is how you define this concept of more. Because if you're saying that some sort of human benefit, right, could also be more, right? So if some process was actually impacting our mental health, let's say, for instance, whatever you want to call it, that could be an additional resource that's extracted from the previous level, which would mean growth could include also our own growth as humans, as humankind, right? At least in theory.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's worth distinguishing to two other concepts here that are really important. Because economists, when talking about individuals, we like to talk about a concept called utility. So utility, and it's nebulous. So, and really under economics frameworks, anything could add to our utility. Again, it could be others, people doing well could add to what we call utility, that kind of thing. And so, ultimately, we're all plugged into VR systems. We never move. We're just, meat in a vat, say, but we're super happy. It could be the great boost in utility, low resource use. So, but it's it's a kind of individual concept there. And that surely, doesn't require people having more, and like in that ultimate sense, it could just be a measure of happiness, whatever it might be, utility. But it's quite a nebulous concept, but really important. Then, of course, you've got this other framework, and quite often which is around this measures of economic activity. So gross domestic product, probably the most famous and well known, and that there really is there like a measure of like dollar flows of and there's various ways of measuring it. But one of them is around production, just simply how much what's the value of what we produce, and that, but they're quite different. A lot of people would argue, and a lot of economists would argue that they're kind of they're very closely aligned. Those who countries with higher GDP have happier people, if you want to sort of say that's what utility is, because they're better able to meet their needs, have less negative events and so on, but they're not necessarily coupled. And so you could say theoretically it could be a world
probably coupled with comfort really well, right? Comfort and happiness there, right? How do you pull comfort away from satisfaction and from a sense of purpose and these things which aren't necessarily comfortable? It's like, but happiness is a big, mushy, ugly word. That's interesting.
Indeed. And then there's a whole interesting world there. How do you even measure happiness? So, obviously, there's a bunch of questions that economists and others have spent a lot of time trying to craft around, what's a single question we can ask someone to get a sense of their happiness? They might ask them, today, not how enjoyable, but how satisfied are you with your life? Things like that. And most of those sort of questions tend to have a fairly good link with GDP as measured, and there was a debate I think this debate's sort of starting to be resolved a bit now around ultimately, was there a cap? Was there sort of a level, a threshold where that happiness sort of just flattens out? But I think most economists now, pretty all, and I'm feeling a bit wary about saying that, I might be wrong here, but I think most would probably say actually that was almost an artifact of just our scales. When you go a scale of 1 to 10, you're naturally going to get it's actually going to flatten out because your scale can't go much higher. But so a lot of people I think a lot of people say, no, it's actually, we haven't really found that limit yet. There's still room for at least those types of questions we ask people.
It sort of correlates on the individual level too, right? Like I think there was this Harvard Business Review study that looked at how much money people actually needed to be happy, and it seemed like after like $70,000 a year or something. I mean, this was a few years back.
But I think that this is what Jason's saying, is that's an artifact of the scale, because if you ask people to rate 1 to 10 how happy they are, you'll naturally get a flattening effect as they get richer.
Like it's the modal amount of richness or something?
You just you can't go above 10 if you're on a 1 to 10 scale. And so if you're but if you made it a 1 to 100 scale, then everybody at the top end of income would cluster around 100. And so it's just an artifact of the fact that if you're asking people to rate how happy are you,
like people don't know they can be happier or something like that. I mean, Yeah, 'cause adding an extra 0 doesn't change anything. People will just stay there 100% happy still. I don't know. Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's difficult to actually know like what it's like to have $1 million unless you have $1 million. So how do you know?
Yeah. So one thing that's pretty solid is within a. So that's sort of I should say that analysis around 70,000. That sort of analysis, I think it was Richard Easterlin sort of had that, and so that's sort of like a cross-country comparison. What's actually quite robust is when you're within a country, like that wealth, happiness sort of measure it's a pretty solid upward slope. If you more money, happier you are, like especially if it's more money than your brother-in-law. So definitely there's a pretty positive link there.
And I bet you that if you were to narrow the study and just look at people, individuals across time, are you happier than you were when you were earning 30,000? Are you happier than you were when you were earning 60,000? Are you happy than you were when you were earning 100,000? And it seems likely that if you narrowed it just to people about their own rate of happiness increase over time, that you would see that there's not a limit to how much happier you get as you have more spending power.
It might not be caused by the other two. I mean, I've known some pretty miserable rich people too, and I've known a lot of miserable poor people, and maybe I knew more miserable poor people, but it just seems like with each level of growth you have a new set of problems too. It's almost this ever receding goal. In a sense.
I would agree with that.
Different.
Absolutely. There's definitely shifting baselines, because again, even those in Australia where we have a pretty good I guess welfare state in some ways. Those who are basically on government benefits are still, they're getting order of magnitude more than people in other countries, and yet, I suppose, they're clearly, and why wouldn't they? They're looking at the rest of Australians and going, "Hang on, this is really, really hard." So there's absolutely shifting baselines, I suppose, and you can't not expect that when you're looking around as to what's possible and your own world, but I'm not quite sure what the second part of that was.
Nature's always kind of getting away from you. I mean, this is the same thing we run into in science too. It's almost like, you can only parameterize the system in a certain way and then experiment with it. And then, as soon as you've constructed a model, you realize that you should have added these other parameters into it. Yes. And it's again, this infinite recession of certainty.
And in context of economics, I think that there's technological progress that is sometimes paradigm shifting. And when the paradigm shift, it's hard to look at what's happened before and then predict how your economic theories are going to be able to fold it into what's actually happening. And so with something like behavioral economics and, let's say, artificial intelligence and the way that it's going to shift the landscape, that feels categorically different to me than any other technological shift that we've ever had. What do you think?
I think it is really quite interesting, because I think coming back to that point around utility and what makes us happy, you can see perhaps in a world of absolute, I suppose AI leads to a world of absolute abundance. We've got these superhuman intelligences leading unrelenting technological progress. We've got more than you could ever need. We can fulfill our needs through virtual means, whatever it may be. So we're unconstrained even by other humans. I think in some ways, thinking about, say, concepts like utility, does it just are our tools for thinking about it even useful in that world? Because all our needs and wants could just be fulfilled in such a different way. So yes, I see that being could of course be quite different. One thing I spent a lot of time thinking about, this comes back to part of my PhD, was around the link between evolutionary biology and economics, and thinking about just how some of those I suppose underlying biological drivers that we've had for a very long time. And I think, again, I'd love to see more of this in behavioral economics and economics being part of our framework. But we've for a long time had a drive around I suppose around attracting a partner, reproduction and the like. And you're trying to go, what does this look like in 20 years? Like given those drives and frameworks, like in a world of, say, is it robot sex or, again, virtual reality, whatever it is, like, again, is it even a useful predictive framework anymore? Does it just simply, from today, do I have any frameworks that are useful for thinking about that? And maybe I do, but it's like as a predictive framework, I don't. I feel like it is a change that's probably beyond, it makes it too hard to give any useful insight into what it might look like in, I don't know if 20 years is the right time frame, but so, a few decades, it could look very, very different.
The funny thing about evolution is I feel like it missed the fact that the organisms, in addition to being shaped by their niche, they also shape their niche as they go. So the landscape that we're responding to is always moving away from us, and we're instructing that by the choices that we make.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think you're looking at like this higher order set of functions at some point where you're looking for feedback loops with your economic environment.
And I guess, and since you're looking for a new set of feedback loops, where you're always trying to keep track of the feedback loops and how they affect your predictions about the future, because ultimately it seems like economics is a discipline of trying to predict the future. Would you agree with that?
I'd say it's probably not fundamentally, but I'd say it's a tool that's quite often used to try and predict the future. So a big part of economics is saying, is around trying to say, understand economic systems, and then from that knowledge, start to say, well, if we change X, if we introduce a new policy, if whatever happens, what is the result? So so it is used quite often as a predictive tool, particularly, again, quite often that prediction is how much will it boost GDP, or, will this particular policy lead to a positive cost benefit analysis? It's probably not used a huge deal as a predictive tool in the grand sense. So people might use it occasionally as part of the toolkit, thinking about, what does the world look like in 20 years, but it's probably, I don't know if it's a broad enough toolkit for doing that in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I don't necessarily mean it in terms of the grand scheme of prediction of being able to say that, like, if we do this is what how the world will look like in 20 years. But I do think that it is, if we do this, then we will be able to achieve this desired outcome in the future, especially with behavioral economics. If you're talking about nudging people, if you're talking about helping them make a decision that you want them to make, it certainly seems like it is occupied at the very least with the future.
It reminds me of the separation between science and technology, right?
Where it's like the science is the process of understanding the mechanisms and the technology is the application.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like you can be completely obsessed with science without giving a damn for predictions or what happens next. You're just trying to say, why does this rock look the way that it looks? Like, why does the landscape look the way it looks? Why do the planets look the way they look?
Yes.
Whereas building a spaceship to go visit the planets is instrumentalizing some of those patterns, right? But you can often do one without the other, which is maybe something that I wonder if you've run into. Like, you can actually build models that are very predictive, like in science, like electromagnetism, let's say, or gravity or something, where we can say exactly how something will behave under certain parameterization, but we don't really understand what the physical mechanism of these processes is. They're just heavily schematized. So is there some sense of that in economics as well, where you can actually have successful models where you don't really understand why they work in the first place?
So I've got two answers to that. And one is absolutely, so economics, like, it is, when it comes to human behavior, it really does treat the mind as a black box. So although, quite often, especially behavioral economists, will try and ascribe what's happening in the mind. We'll come up with some description after fact. Really, it's concerned with behavior. And you do an intervention, people change behavior, and you go, great. And then you might tell a story afterwards. But it really is a black box. And quite often, people describe economics and also behavioral economics as if science. So it's like we make decisions as if this is the underlying reality, or and so when we design models of how people make decisions, it's not really how people make decisions. So one of my favorite little examples here is, so we spend a lot of time talking about what we call utility functions. So actually a mathematization of how people weight the different sort of, I guess, consumption, the benefit they get from the different consumption goods they have. And in fact, it's like, it's so complicated quite often, we'll set exam questions where people have to go, here's someone's choice, here's a utility function, what will they decide? And yet they're going, well, this is how people behave. And of course we don't do that. We don't actually have utility functions that we then, as I guess, maximize. The economists would say is we behave as if we maximize the utility function. So there's this real black box part there.
It's so similar. It's so similar to engineering. I mean, it's the same thing, right? The ancestors, they didn't understand the flight equations for the bow and arrow, right? They just fine-tuned it. They operated as if they understood those things because they appeared as natural consequences of all their experimentation throughout the world and their lives and everything like that. And I feel like there's got to be so much buried intuition inside of all of these formula.
Absolutely, and that's like I always sort of say this, like it's always that that's like hopefully a role that psychology starts to do more of a role of, or neuroscience and so on, to start to input more of that, and then we'll get richer models of that we can use in economics. But I sort of have a related, and in some ways it's sort of like a contradictory sort of critique around this point is, so in behavioral economics in particular, because in some ways it's a critique of economics. What it has this whole bunch of anomalies that relate to, this is basically where the basic economic model, sort of quite often called the rational actor model, fails. And it's a really long list now. There's lots of them. You go to the Wikipedia page, there's over 200 sort of cognitive biases listed there. Mm-hmm. And there, it's actually kind of a weird thing where we actually don't have many or any. In fact, I'm saying there's no really good models that then try and go, how do we actually narrow it down? And so sometimes I actually think there's almost a lack of model around it. What we've instead got, we've got a bunch of tools. We've got a really sort of messy toolkit, lots of interesting spanners and hammers and screwdrivers, and you grab one every now and then when you want to check, when you want to change someone's behavior, when you want them to get to use less energy, whatever it is, pull it out toolkit. But there's actually not a lot of that basic science. Sort of saying what is happening here.
It's like we can almost state the negation of it. Like these are biases that are working against our model of cognition. But if you have 200 of them, it seems like you probably don't have a very good model of cognition as a whole in the first place.
Yeah. Well, it strikes me that emotionality is treated as a bug in cognitive models, right? So we have this model of the ideal rational actor that will always behave in line with the Bayesian analysis of how to update your priors and direct yourself in a goal-oriented way towards the thing that you want. But people aren't like that. Like there is a rationalist community, obviously, that prides themselves upon that, but there's also a post-rationalist community.
People are super reactive. That's what I'm saying about this Darwinian stuff, too.
Well, so there's literally a movement. I don't know if there's like a group of people in the San Francisco Bay Area that call themselves rationalists. Right. There's like Scott Alexander, Eliezer Yudkowsky, and these are people who have built their entire philosophy upon the principles that you can live your life as a purely rational person. And there are rules by which you should govern your behavior that will allow you to be rational. But I've tried this out on my friends who have no idea who the rationalists are, and I explain it to them. And every single one of them is horrified by the very prospect of living like that.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting question. A few set of questions I think for hearing that. One is this simple. Can you train it? Can you actually, if you suddenly go, I'm going to be this uber rational person. I'm going to only, have accurate Bayesian updating of my beliefs and so on. Is it even possible to do it? Because we are truly emotional people. We need emotions to make decisions. There's, look at the work of people like Antonio Damasio. He wrote this really great book, Descartes' Error. And there, I guess the evidence is when people lack an emotion, they can't even make decisions. It's such an important part of how we make a call. The person with no emotion will stand there in the toothpaste aisle looking at the 10 types of toothpaste and just never be able to weight that cost benefit analysis. But those who have a bit of emotional reaction will go, I like the blue or whatever it might be, and grab it, and they can operate in society. So it's pretty interesting on a lot of levels, that whole thing of is emotional, is decision making absent emotion even possible or practical? Can we get there if you try and push yourself in that direction?
And there's also the question of how good is our data, right? Because we believe that somebody mentioned the other day the coastline measurement problem. which is that how do you actually go about measuring a coastline? How are you measuring every single inlet? Are you measuring around every single boulder? How far up a river delta do you go before it's not coast? Like, where is the limit? Because I'm reading this book right now by Peter Zeihan, and he's talking about the waterways and how important they are for geopolitical development. And one of the things that he keeps talking about is the way that river systems, when they are connected to one another and connected to the coast, they are part of the ocean. He treats them as basically oceanic ports when they're, on the Great Lakes or something, once there's a canal. And so what does it mean to measure a coastline? And where are you drawing the limits of your model? And then if you're trying to base your rationality upon the fact that you've accurately measured the coastline, if you haven't established what that means completely and fully and unambiguously, you could be orders of magnitude off in a way that you don't even know because you haven't laid out the limits of your model, which is kind of what you were talking about the model making that has to have boundary conditions for what it is that you're dealing with. And I feel like anything that has to do with collecting human data and human preferences and human tendencies suffers from the boundary conditions of the model, because how well do we know our own interior states, let alone the interior states of some idealized person?
Yeah. So maybe two, three, economic things that I think really interesting from that. So traditionally, economists really like this idea called revealed preferences, where they'll simply go, whatever you do must have been what you wanted to do, and let's have a system where people can, I guess, whatever it is, do whatever it is they want to do. And so it's very agnostic about what's right, what's wrong. But if you see someone doing something, you simply go, what's their revealed preference? Great. They're obviously better off if they get to do that as opposed to not doing it. So there's this real, you see sort of threads there, benefits to more choice. If things are cheaper or they've got more, I guess, a weaker budget constraint, they're going to be happier. So that's sort of a very traditional economic way of looking at it. But then, in the world of behavioral economics, is this really interesting question of going, what do people really want? Because of course we make all sorts of decisions that we later regret, and you then have to ask, what is our true preference? Like, what do we really want? And it's a really interesting philosophical sort of debate there. So is it the older person? Is it the later person? Should they have precedence because they're the one looking back going, I wish as a youngster I never had a great time? Or should it be the young person? Because of course, do you want your old future self constraining the fact you've got a life living it now? Is there some higher level, I guess, judgment that we can make about what is the good decision? And so from that, there's been some really interesting philosophical debates about, what is that point? Can we ever get hold of it? Because if the person internally doesn't know, or they've got multiple different sort of views as to what they want and what the right thing to do is, then it's a really tough task. Then as a policymaker coming on top and going, well, I think you really should be conserving energy or whatever it might be. When you've got this individual, who might have multiple views at multiple times, depending on whether hot or cold state or when it is.
And that opens up the question of whether or not people actually want to live in society, right?
Whoa, how'd you get there?
Okay, well, the way that I get there is that we so all of this is part of a social process. Like, it's hard for me to see, especially something like behavioral economics, as divorced from the study of humans in context of a society. And oftentimes the revealed preferences are that they don't want to live within the constraints of of a society, because when you start talking about the common good, when you start talking about public health, when you start talking about these really big topics, I think that people's revealed preferences end up being, well, I want to do what I like, not what some unnamed body wants to do.
Well, there's been a lot of blood spilt in the name of public good, right? I mean, I don't think that it can be overstated, actually.
Yeah, and so people are very skeptical about that idea. And so I think I wonder if that's something that comes out in these measurement tactics, which is that people behave in ways where they don't really want to have to think about other people beyond their immediate circle. Like they don't want to upset their parents or their friends or their siblings or something, or their cat, but they don't. The person living in in the middle of nowhere, who you never will meet and who's kind of the dark matter of civilization, do you really want to be pressured by what that person wants? I think most people don't. I think that creates an unbelievable difficulty for survival, because not only are you concerned about you're now having to think about all of these people that have no bearing on your life, but who you have a moral obligation to.
Yeah. Although it's interesting, like when you say a moral obligation to, like what would you say the moral obligation is, or?
Well, it's whatever you're being nudged towards, right? Because the moral obligation is decided at a higher level, because you're basically presented with the moral obligation of what is it that you owe to everybody else.
Well, yeah, like a great example would be like the vaccination issue with minorities, right? Especially in our country, because there's a long history of medical experimentation on disenfranchised populations in our country. I think probably globally, but I can really speak confidently of our own situation. And so it's totally reasonable that these people wouldn't be interested in joining in for the public good on something that they've been betrayed by in the past.
Yeah. And it seems like there's no real capacity for being able to examine that, because we have kind of, as a whole, as let's say Western industrial nations that are part of the World Economic Forum, there is definitely a cultural trend towards a specific way of encountering the world and encountering an obligation to others that is global. And then you have economics as the tool of nudging people towards those decisions. And I wonder if that isn't where a lot of the noise in the system comes from, because people are being nudged towards something that they rationally don't want. And so the reason that they behave in ways that are irrational is more about their own personal perspectives.
Yeah, I agree with that framing, because I think vaccination's a really interesting one, because of course I think what happened there is at the top levels it was that's a good thing. Probably is for a lot of people. They didn't simply let's get more people vaccinated. Let's send out behavioral economists designing heaps of experiments to go, what's the right messaging, to get people to get vaccinated. What can we design incentive schemes to get them vaccinated? All those sort of things that all happened, and I think it was just generally assumed to be the right thing. I think, but the bit which I really agree with what you were saying there is like this question of assuming, like this assumption quite often that we have that a certain behavior is irrational, and behavioral economists do this all the time, where they simply make a call and say, well, I'm just going to go this, we think this is an irrational behavior. They're making a decision that's very risky. They're overreacting to the size of the loss, whatever it might be, and then that's the basis where they then go and nudge them. And I think quite often perhaps those behaviors aren't quite as irrational as people think. They're actually quite often it's because they're pursuing an objective that's different to what we believe their objective to be. That's probably, I think, the most common one. But other times it might just be because they've got knowledge, their own internal knowledge, perhaps their own internal objectives, their own internal I guess beliefs, and it's like on that basis that they're coming to quite a different call. And when you dig down, you might actually that's a perfectly sensible thing. Why on earth are we trying to get them to do this other behavior that we otherwise believe they should do?
Yeah, I think it really played out with I just want to not move past the vaccinations for a minute.
I don't want to move past it either, but I think I hear that weird electronic noise that you were talking about in your microphone. And so I wonder if can you just unplug it and ground the plug on your fingers and then plug it back in?
Sure.
Because I heard it build and then it got really loud, and now it's in the background constantly.
Okay. Hang on a sec.
Yeah, that sounds better.
That sounds a lot better, yeah.
How about now?
It's still a little hum. I think I can just low pass or high pass it out. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
It's just a low frequency thing that kind of hums a little bit.
I actually can't hear it.
It sounds better to me.
Anyway.
But I was just saying there's an interesting cost benefit analysis that just came out of the UK that you were telling me about. Maybe you should tell the story because you know more about it than me. But the basic punchline was that of course, this policy was motivated by, it's for everyone's public health benefit that people continue to get these boosters. But then I don't know if it was economists or who, but somebody crunched the numbers and essentially found that the cost of preventing one hospitalization, in other words, at $30 a dose of these boosters, was extraordinary, in the millions of dollars for preventing a single hospitalization. And as a result of that, the government just decided, hey, this isn't actually a good use of our health money, essentially. If we actually just took care of these patients with that money instead, it would be a better use of the money than trying to prevent this, difficult to put a finger on virus.
Yeah, I subscribe to Alex Berenson's newsletter, and Alex Berenson used to be a reporter for the New York Times, and then he started talking about the COVID stuff on Twitter, and then he got banned from Twitter, and now he's suing Twitter, and he's
oh, that's right, that guy.
Yeah, he's very I don't know how to put it. He's very argumentative. And I don't necessarily agree with the way that he goes about presenting the data, but because he's so focused on the fact that this was...
he was getting nudged a lot.
He was?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so he's very upset about it, and so he writes about it. But basically, he pulled out a study, which is that the British government pulled out the data from their vaccination campaign, and this is on the UK government website, where they're basically like, okay, in order to prevent one severe COVID vaccination, we would have had to administer 1 million doses.
Prevent one severe COVID case, you mean?
What did I say?
You said COVID vaccination. To prevent
Sorry,
COVID
I was thinking hospitalization. Good call.
Cool.
One severe COVID hospitalization would require 1 million vaccines. And at the end of the day, they were like, that's not a price that we're willing to pay. And so we're going to, and this was for a specific population. It was like healthy men between the ages of 30 and 45.
And it's like, we should just take that $30 million and spend it on the sick patient. That would go a lot further in this case, something like that. So it's interesting how sometimes the goals, even if it's like the road to hell is paved in good intentions kind of situation where you are motivated by the will to make people safe and healthy, but the tactics are somewhat misguided.
Yeah. Although in that little story there, it sounds like a pretty traditional use of economic cost benefit analysis in the end to, I guess, make that call. So it's like going back to the good old toolkit and saying, what gives us the bigger return on the dollars?
Yeah. No, I think it's an amazing economic success story. It's it's a beautiful case of where you can actually realign your exercises, your operations with your motivations and really step back and see, is all of this effort going to achieve what we aim to be achieving with it?
Yeah. Yeah, and also that's not to show again, sometimes at least that usefulness of that dollar value sometimes, because cause at least when it comes to government, quite often, I guess their lever is taxpayer dollars that they can spend, and when that's your lever, that's a case of how you allocate it. Then to be able to put a dollar value on those things is sometimes pretty useful. Obviously things like hospital care cost money. I would have put on there. What's really interesting, I suppose, is to have that. Underlying all that is this assumption when you go, we're going to avoid one hospitalization. That requires you to put some value on quality of life years is probably the measure that they use to say quality of life years. How many quality of life years are being lost because someone then gets COVID? And that's where you have you're able to balance the two. Absent being able to put some dollar value on that person's life, you once again you're stuck and you're comparing sort of things that you can't otherwise don't easily compare.
When the pandemic was unfolding, do you have a sense of how economists were looking at this? Because there was some noise where people were like, the cost of lockdowns is worse than the cost of COVID, and they were trying to make calculations about this. But do you have and I think Australia was very different than the United States because of how harsh your lockdowns were.
Yes. So we did have some pretty harsh lockdowns. We basically had a series of lockdowns in the first year. We had a stretch for probably, I think it was probably 2 or 3 months where schools were shut down, and we weren't allowed, basically weren't allowed to go with more than, I don't know, if I can't remember what the limits were. So I had I had twin boys in kindergarten of their first year at school. So I really did feel the fact that they were no longer leaving the house for a while. But Australia also effectively closed the border. And then what was really interesting is because of that, Australia effectively, pretty much eliminated COVID in that first year and went back to normal for a good chunk of the year. And ultimately what happened is, because we kept, lots of debate about whether it should happen. We kept bringing Australians back in. They had to do a couple of weeks of hotel quarantine, but the hotel quarantine kept leaking. And so eventually in pretty June, July of 2021, so we went well into the second year, the Delta strain emerged and it got out. And then we went to another round of lockdowns where again, schools closed and the like. And that was quite harsh for a while until eventually, I guess we learned to live with it. But on the role of economists, I want to be a little bit harsh on at least the Australian economists, because I don't think they weren't very useful, to be blunt. Because what would have been really interesting, especially during each of those lockdowns, would have been for more economists to be giving probably really, I guess, solid cost benefit analysis of those schools versus I guess the cost of education, particularly on lower income families, the jobs, just the reduction in lifestyle, and trying to put a lot more dollar on it. Instead, what seemed to happen is there was a real coalescence around, I guess the warring parties, and I guess where we had probably, I think most economists just went, we need to lock the border and have really harsh lockdowns. There was this big signed letter here in Australia where most prominent economists signed it and said, we need really harsh lockdowns. There's no economy without when people are afraid. And this wasn't that useful. So because the policymakers are going, well, there's actually still lots of choices at the margin we have to make. Like, how far should people be allowed to go from their homes? What are essential services? Should we be allowing Australians to come back in through hotel quarantine? What is the cost of this school closure? There just wasn't any of that. And so it was kind of useless. And then, of course, on the other end, there was a bunch of economists going, the costs are just way too high. It's crazy. Let people out. You're crushing our liberty. But again, they probably did actually a little bit more of the analysis, but there still wasn't this great sort of crunching that I think ultimately the policymakers could pick up and go, actually, there's some really interesting in-depth stuff. Instead, there's probably a little bit more of the political instinct kicking in. And I don't know if you probably read some of the famous economists in papers, like Paul Krugman's a classic one where, as an economist, he's amazing. Like, some of his work on trade and so on is amazing. And yet as a New York Times columnist, I think he gets into political wars far more often, and the economic analysis isn't as exciting or deep or useful as perhaps it would be if he sort of kept his non-partisan, non-political hat on.
And go ahead, Shai.
I was just going to say, there's also this other aspect too, where it strikes me that the interdisciplinary misunderstandings could be coming into play, right? Because the scientists are also trying to participate in this discussion about what the best thing to do is in a situation like this. And, it's fascinating because you look at historic cases of extreme quarantine and it didn't really work out too. Like, it would be not totally unreasonable to say that the Native Americans were in quarantine against smallpox for thousands of years. And then when they actually met it later, it was absolutely devastating to the population. And I wonder if there are just downstream effects of these kind of behaviors too that would cost, actually, or are costing us now to some extent. We had an absolutely miserable cold season this year in the United States. I haven't totally looked at the numbers, but I don't know. I got sick. Everybody I know got sick. It was terrible. And
I think that's actually a really interesting point, because we talk a lot about, interdisciplinary research between computer science and biology, or electrical engineering and chemistry, and there's a lot of ink spilled over the value of bringing people together, but I don't have a sense that I've never seen an article about, immunology and economics should work together. Is there, am I missing it and it's there and there's a push for it? Or do you feel like economists are kind of in their own lane and the rest of the sciences are like, whatever, you do stuff over there, it's your thing?
No, economists are a little bit different. Economists aren't so much in there. Economists are trying to march into every field they can get into.
Nice.
Real vein of economic imperialism. So there is actually a really big, there's a massive number of, say, health economists, and I'm sure many of them think about immunology and that kind of stuff. So it's probably there. Like, I'm definitely not anywhere near having a lot of depth of knowledge or being near the frontier, but yeah, there's certainly there. One thing that this is pretty a gross generalization, but economists, they love being imperialists. They love marching into new areas. They're not always that great at working with the people in those areas. They're much more likely to sort of march in and go, yeah, our way of thinking and working is much more thorough and rigorous than your, harebrained sort of way of thinking about the world. And so quite often, it's probably not hugely collaborative, and they wind up talking past each other a lot of the time.
Well, that seems to be the case with any two groups of specialized human beings. They always think that they have the best answer. It seems like I suppose it's not totally unique.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of exceptions.
But you did mention that you were I think you mentioned it, or I put it in your mouth accidentally, about this evolutionary analogy to the way that economics is pursued, and in terms of like satisfying our needs and how the science itself is evolving. And I feel like there are some basic biological principles at play that have to necessarily reach into the economic domain.
They do, but I think that there is the technological difficulty of, okay, so let's say we have an evolutionary need for socialization. Is it enough to replace regular socialization with listening to a podcast or sitting in a vat where you're connected to the metaverse? Like, will that be enough? And if you can base economic theory on evolutionary biology and be like, well, that'll be enough and people will still be satisfied, will that then force a nudge into a direction that maybe isn't actually utilitarian?
Yeah. Well, just on that first part of your comment there about the technological side, throwing it off. So I read a paper, published it in 2015, where with a friend of mine, Lionel Page, we basically took the evolutionary angle and tried to put into some fertility projections, where we said let's add a bit of evolutionary biology into at least one framework. And so every 2 years, United Nations puts out these world population prospects, sort of population projections to 2100. And what we did is we just threw into their models the heritability of fertility. So fertility tends to be heritable. So it's from twin studies, I guess even other genomic studies now using relatedness, but basically the idea, if you have more children, then your children are more likely then to have more children, and so on, sort of, I guess, keeping other things constant. But so anyway, in that paper, we sort of said, we expect, because fertility is heritable, those who have more children now will form a greater part of the population. We expect a fertility rebound. And it's kind of funny. I have no faith in that conclusion anymore. Like at the time, I was kind of like a little bit equivocal. I just have zero faith now because of that very thing where I'm going, yes, people have this drive to reproduce. Fertility is heritable. But again, you suddenly introduce whatever else is coming over the next 10, 20 years. And is it just going to completely, is it going to fulfill that need without people actually having to have children? And so in that same way, that socialization, like to the extent it comes through podcasts or we get even better technology for having socialization, does it simply, in some ways, completely fulfill that need, that evolutionary need, that need, perhaps, for social belonging, whatever that proximate goal is that leads to ultimate reproductive success way back then? Does it get met by this new technology? And so I become really loath to say, we're going to see certain, what the future will look like, given that, that uncertainty and the different ways that, perhaps our proximate objectives can be met.
Yeah, you never could have predicted that having children would be a cost as opposed to a benefit in the past, right? I mean, if you had a farm or something, all you need is bodies out there in the field, and you want people to, help you build the barn. And
even when you have industrialization and you're still on the farm, but your children are in the city, they're sending remittances back to the countryside. If you're an immigrant, you send your children, you kind of like cast them into the future, and you put them into a place where they're going to do better than you. And there's always this idea that the children will provide for you. But if there is a shift where all of a sudden children are just a perpetual money pit, as opposed to the other way around, that's a shift.
They grow up, they turn 18, they move away.
You.
Yeah, and that's it,
Yeah. But that's that point you're making, though, it's kind of interesting, like, because you're almost describing it like an economist in some ways. It's like, and I'm on there going, part of me goes, well, where are children in the utility function? Like, surely children, like, there's something there, and it's kind of interesting that in the end it does become that the cost thing becomes such a major driver, as opposed to simply going, my God, like, like my kids, and like, there's no amount of money that would ever replace that, at least in my head, I guess.
Well, maybe like 2 kids for you, right? But you don't need to have 15, right? I mean, it's, I don't know. It's like, I'm not saying that economics is the only thing that matters in people's decision making at that point. But it certainly might scale the matter, I wonder. At least it seems to, in my experience, among people I know who are having children, it seems to at least temper the decision. And whereas if you look into the past, it's just these enormous families, right? I mean, it seemed to be absolutely essential for thriving as a family.
Well, you have pockets of that, right? So in the United States, we have Mormonism, and Mormonism is a very high reproductive culture, where if I've ever met anybody who is my age, who's from a 10-person family, they've been Mormons. And so that does, and the population is growing, and they have pretty solid cultural centers, and it seems like there is some aspect of the heritability of it, where if you're part of a culture that places a really high emphasis on having lots of kids, and you're surrounded by people who all place the same value on that, as long as you maintain a sufficiently insular group, then you wouldn't be able to be nudged away from a large family size in the same way. And so it seems like there is a behavioral nudge that comes from policy level decisions at the, and I don't even think that this is conspiratorial at this point, but like the World Economic Forum, the UN, there's goals that are set for what the world should look like 100 years from now. Like the countries get together and they make decisions. And so
the oligarchs, right? Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
And they're hanging out with the Davos people, right? So like there's definitely like a sense of there's a master plan. And it was hilarious because there was actually a World Economic Forum panel discussion entitled, "Are we ready for the New World Order?" And underneath it, YouTube put a little marker, which is that the New World Order was an unfounded conspiracy theory. Which I thought was hilarious. And that they actually renamed the video since then. I still have a screen capture of it. But, so there's a plan. But there's also... Oh, go ahead.
I'm going to say, what are the features of this New World Order that they were talking about?
I think that it's just
you
concerted...
will own nothing and you will be happy.
You will own nothing and you'll be happy, yeah. I mean, I think that it's a concerted downgrade of materialism. It is a... urbanization of populations. It is an economic development plan that pushes people into progressively more concentrated urban centers in order to be able to release the environmental pressure on the rest of the environment. Where if you live in a city, you have a smaller carbon footprint, and you start to notice this, right? Because this is I have a friend who works at a marketing company, and I was talking to her about this, and she is always amazed by the fancy interactive graphics that places like the New York Times have, where there was a recent article which was they looked at your carbon footprint based off of where you lived in various cities, and she knows how much a graphic like that costs, just in people hours and effort, and she's just bowled over by the fact that they're spending $50,000-$60,000 to put together a graphic like this. And so you see it percolating through the media, where these are the sort of perspectives that are being offered, which is you should move to a dense urban center like California.
Well, these are more consumer-friendly situations too, right? I mean, they're certainly marketed under the guise of taking care of the environment, whatever that is exactly, but they're really fundamentally actually making things more efficient in terms of the consumer-industrial relationship at the same time.
Maybe, but I think that you actually, like, we live in the countryside right now, and I feel like in the countryside, you are often in a position where you need more than you would if you live in an urban center. Where if you live in an urban center, you have gyms, you have yoga studios, you have public goods that prevent you from having to accumulate your own material. And so if you live in a town that has really good public transportation, you don't need to have a car. And so there's definitely a concentration of consumerism, but I think that it's also coupled to this idea of you'll own nothing and be happy, where you don't have to have a car, you don't have to have a television, you don't have to have like all of these things.
I mean, all the people I know in this city have cars and TVs and all that stuff.
We don't know anyone who lives in a dense urban city center. Everybody we know lives in the burbs.
I mean,
every single one of them lives in the burbs to varying
degrees. They might
degrees.
live in Metropoli.
I don't know anyone who lives, and this is weird, I don't know anyone who lives in a high-rise.
Roger?
No, she lives in like a 3-story apartment building.
Anyways.
And so, like, I think that's the ultimate push. It's like a modern version of Kowloon walled city, right? Like, we're not living in like subterranean hovels. We're living in really nice tall high rises where there's green stuff, and you see the solar punk aspect of architecture kind of coming into the fold, where it's like, what will the cities of the future look like? But oh, go ahead.
It's kind of funny, like, because we say they're going to do all that and they're going to be happy. Like, are they going to be happy? Like, I think it's kind of a really interesting question. Like, will they? Well, do you think they'd be happy? Like, why do they think people would be happy if that's their existence?
Well, are they really motivated by making people happy or by making more economic growth somehow? I mean,
but that seems like a behavioral nudge. That seems like a nudge.
Yeah.
Right? It's like you buy into the new economy and you'll be happy. And that's kind of a nebulous promise. Everybody wants to be happy, and why not?
Well, let's say buy into the new economic economy and it will be good for growth. And that's not really convincing enough. So yeah, you'll be happy also.
Yeah, I buy that. But how do we get it? Oh, go ahead.
I think that's just the question that's not asked enough. For some of these shifts, like we do all this, I guess engineering for whatever response, and just don't often ask enough. Will these people be better off and happier? Like like again, it comes back to the example of the social comparison with energy usage. Like this simple. The question of question that's asked is, will it save energy? Not will it make them happier or better off or whatever it might be. And it sounds like this. I'm hearing the same. I guess feel the same thread talking there when you're going. Everyone's going to be urbanized and having no car and have really low footprints, living in these high rises in these super dense urban centers. But are they going to be better off? Like in any sense of I guess well-being as we could measure it.
Is there a lot of discussion about what that word means and what, like the word cost and the word happiness seems central to this discussion, but they seem like some of the most ill-defined concepts I've ever encountered.
Yeah, absolutely. So well-being's a really tough one. In fact, so I work quite often, or both actually in my professional life and now in academia, with financial services firms around how to get people to make better financial decisions. So in some ways, how to nudge them towards making better financial decisions. And one of the nice things about being working with banks and so on is that it is actually, there's a money measure there. Like in the end, you can go, do they have more or less money? So at least on one dimension, it's easy. But there's this bigger question here. What is like we always ask the question, what is financial well-being? Like what is it? Because it isn't actually just money. It's around security. Like, do they feel safe? Do they feel confident? It's perhaps can they withstand a shock if something goes wrong? And so we have endless debates and conversations around what that really is, because you think about, you're doing a little intervention going, let's help them save more. But of course, saving more, it means, it's not just saving more in that account. It's, do they save more in total? Like, do they avoid debt? Do they not just get debt and then get more savings? And then you're looking across their overarching thing, like, are they happier because, maybe they're saving more, but now they're not buying food or feeding the dog or feeding the kids or, maybe just not going on holidays. Are they better off there? And then, of course, and so in that space, we spend a huge amount of time talking about what is well-being, like what is the outcome we're really trying to get in that environment. It's really hard, really tough. And that's a fairly simple environment, I think, because it is, and then it's financial decision making. It's like starts off in dollars and cents to begin with. But then more broadly in economics, like there is a huge literature sort of going, what is well-being? Like what makes people better off? And there's some really good ideas. There's lots of different questionnaires and surveys that try and measure it and capture it. But it's also partly, because it's so complicated, it's why some economists just go, look, let's just maximize GDP and then everyone can be happy under their own definition with this extra resources we have. So there's a few escape hatches there
I'll be really curious if that pays off in the future. Like, I'll be really curious if under the current paradigm in the West that we have with these, like, the massive crisis of meaning, I mean, I spend a lot of time with college kids, and I feel like it's a much more apocalyptic social landscape than when I was in college. I feel like people, I grew up in the 90s, which was this like super prosperous, wonderful time in America. It just was all milk and honey. Except all the music was about how much the world sucked. How disappointed people are in Christianity.
Good music, though.
It was good music, yeah. So what am I trying to say?
Is apocalypse coming? Is that your sense?
I feel like it's more of an issue now than ever to to bake something else into the cake, right? To understand the dissatisfaction that arises that in spite of GDP. And I'm very curious if those trends continue to stabilize or if they recede, right? If whatever measures we can concoct for well-being, if they become less, just less stable over time, because, a lot of the technological fixes we found for sadness and depression, they seem to actually not be working as well as we had thought we were measuring them originally, particularly with the pharmaceutical interventions and things like this, so if, in some sense we thought, okay, well, we can buy our way into better mental health, into more well-being, and it doesn't really seem like that's working out, and I don't know if the data is long-term enough to really make those conclusions.
So let me see if I can build on that. My immediate sense is that in the past, well-being has been associated with jobs. And if you have a job and if your job is good, you're going to feel good. And I have this feeling, and it'd be interesting to get your perspective on it, that the idea of a job, the way that we've always had it, if technological progress continues the way that it's going, is basically on the way out. And I can see it if growth in AI continues, and this is outside the conversation of is AI intelligent or not, is AI sentient or not. It's literally, is AI good enough to do most of the jobs that currently are out there? Because that's all that you would need.
Let's assume that it is, just for the sake of
Let's assume that it is.
Line of thought.
And so if AI is good enough to do most of the jobs, and historically we have always gauged the well-being of society by employment numbers, by salary numbers, what happens when that goes away? Because I think that might have something to do with...
Or at least is substantially minimized to the point that...
Yeah, and I think that that's partially what these college kids are feeling, is that they're looking out onto the landscape and they're like, well, what do you mean job security? What do you mean career? Like, that seems almost archaic, the way that an internal combustion engine feels archaic.
Yeah, it's super interesting because from a GDP point of view, like once you get that super intelligence, like GDP will go crazy. But then, of course, you start to go, who owns the machines? Like, how is it distributed? And you start to get into really interesting questions of, I guess ultimately, is this truly a life of leisure for everyone, or a life of leisure for a few? It gets near, sort of John Maynard Keynes sort of been. I think when he exactly wrote it, 1920s, probably writing this idea, for our prospects for our grandchildren would be that, they'd be working 10 hours a day or whatever it was because we just have this life of leisure. And obviously it hasn't happened yet, but maybe it's just around the corner. But that whole idea relies on some kind of either common ownership of that amazing productive AI, or redistribution of the rents from ownership of that amazing AI. So it's super interesting there. But I think there's another really cool thread, which I think about this one a lot, which is just this idea that there is actually really good data around just the mere act of having a job, like actually adds to well-being. Like just getting given cash versus having a job to get that cash. Like there's actually a material difference, and I don't know how much that's socially shaped, or it's more around how we get meaning from the world. But I think that's also a really interesting tension. Like in the end, if we're all we've got all the resources we need to do nothing, to have this life of leisure, what does it really mean in terms of fulfillment? When we're answering that survey around how satisfied are you with your life right now? Because you're just pottering around, sort of reading an interesting book, or if that's assuming that's what people do.
And that's just that's part of the comfort trap too, right? That's just another result of measuring our well-being in terms of comfort. It's like, okay, well, let's say we can all be comfortable and not work jobs. Well, what will we do with our time? Like, will we be able to self-organize ourselves into structures and institutions that have nothing to do with getting a salary? Is the scientist still going to go to work and come up with, new molecules? Is the tailor going to still make shirts?
But I think that it comes down to costs,
design
right?
shirts,
because we're not very wealthy. And so whenever I sit down and I think about a creative project, my first consideration is, how much will the raw materials for this project cost? And if you have a job, your bar for the projects that you can take on is higher than if you are on some kind of universal income, because that's meant to keep you at subsistence level as opposed to prosperity level. And so I think that the question about whether or not people under the post-jobs paradigm will be able to organize themselves into doing stuff will be decided by how much purchasing power do they have in order to accumulate the raw materials necessary for their pursuits. Because if you're a scientist...
How do you get people purchasing power if they don't have jobs? Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, like is UBI... Is UBI... What do you think about UBI?
Well, I think UBI is, I think it's really interesting idea that, like, in the world of true AI, super intelligent AI producing everything, I think it's just a simple, I guess it's kind of almost necessary if it's owned very narrowly. But I think it's one of those things where when does it become viable? And because you think about I guess the terms in it, basic. So what do you need for a basic level of income to have a life that's meaningful? So we have this debate all the time in Australia about, we have our unemployment benefit. It's probably more generous than the US, but it's pretty low. So if you lose your job, it's really tough. And so the question is, like, is that enough for a basic income? And of course, as soon as you start getting to levels going, well, actually, we think it should be, say 50% of say the poverty line. Let's suppose it's at the poverty line, which is probably doubling it from what it is. Like, can we even afford it? What does that look like in a high tax society that you need to fund it? And that's the first level of basic. And then next bit, you just go universal. Like, is it really universal? Like, are you, like, in the end, well, you think about what the world's going to look like in 2100. In 2100, there's going to be, I think it's 6 billion Africans, I think. Like, are you, like, is this really an inclusive, global, universal basic income, or is it all sort of each country who happens to own a bit of technology gets it themselves? And so, like, I got, on one level, conceptually, I can see it, like, as being necessary in this world of superintelligence. But what's the, how do you get to a point where it's like truly meeting whatever a basic need is in this new world? Because the new world will be pretty abundant. Like, basic may feel actually fairly good, and then how wide do we spread it? Do we really make this a universal thing where the global population benefits and gets it? So, I'm not sure where that ends up.
And there's a lot of other aspects of that too, which is, okay, so let's say one person wants to get a huge library, accumulate books, and all they do is read. And then somebody else loves to trophy hunt and wants to, like, go and kill lions on the Serengeti. Surely there's not an opening of all possibilities where we're like, kill as many endangered animals as you want. We're post scarcity. Right?
I think housing is a really good example of that, right? Because everybody wants to live on the beach in Malibu, but that's just not conceivable, right? It's like the equality dream is somehow fractured from the beginning, because the whole idea is that certain desirable outcomes are limited to begin with. Yeah, like that's the entire thing of Peter Zeihan, right? His the reason that I'm into this book is because we listened to him on Rogan the other day, and have you ever listened to him talk?
No.
He's a geopolitical analyst who is the most certain sounding person that I have ever met in my entire life. Okay. And he makes predictions, like he's like, China's going to collapse in 10 years. The United States' hegemony is absolutely certain. And he has almost like a thermodynamic explanation for it, because for him it's all based on landscape and your ease of transport and your ease of protection. So like in the beginning of this book that I'm reading right now, which is The Accidental Superpower, he talks about why Egypt was able to establish such an advanced empire so early. And he's like, when you have the Nile Valley, you have an area of incredibly fertile, stable territory that is bounded on all sides by impassable desert. You have ease of transport within the empire and nearly impossibility of being attacked by somebody across 600 miles of impassable desert. Therefore, they rise. Therefore, they become powerful. Same thing for America. America is just at the beginning of its power because geopolitics. But I'm suspicious of the way of anybody who speaks so certainly from first principles. But something that I value in what he's saying is that there is a certain physical limitation to the way that the world can be organized, like what Shilo's saying about the beach in Malibu. Like, there's a limited capacity of this exclusive area, and if all of a sudden you create a condition wherein everyone has UBI, you can't all move there, and that plays out over and over and over and over again. Like, living in the Central Valley in California blows. Living in Nebraska, I mean, no offense to Nebraska, but like it's not the same thing as living in Austin, Texas. We're somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Australia, right? Like, most of it is not it's not particularly green or lush.
Indeed. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so economists like let's call that positional goods. Like they're constrained and there's also an inherent hierarchy in them. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting, because it's the other thing too. Like, it's not just even around sort of, I guess, actual physical goods. So to the extent we care about status, like in the end, there's still a hierarchy or a ranking, and however we determine it. But in a world of UBI, if maybe most people are on it, we'll obviously find different ways to battle. But only one person is going to be top dog, and so on. And so there's probably some human needs that I guess, or desires that are going to be not fully met, or at least we'll still have to fight over them. There'll still have to be some system and way by which everyone determines how they're allocated.
Well, people want to be motivated by their successes too, right? Like, I think people really want to feel like if they work their ass off, they'll get something special out of it. And this is kind of the fundamental failure of all these utopian plans, is just that they fail to account for the fact that people's motivations are diverse and their will is diverse, and it can be extreme in both directions. And there's something comforting about that. I think that's why the West has been such an overwhelming success compared to all other systems of government. Is just that it does allow people that sense of mobility. At least our country is. I would say if there's like one American value, it's like you can get yourself somewhere if you try hard enough for something. And it would be maybe extremely dangerous to have that disappear or be marginalized.
We like to think the same here. So Michael, I know you teach it. So Anastasia, you teach too, or
I've taught in the past. I'm currently between positions.
Because I guess the question is, and this is something that I'm grappling with a lot now, because I think about, okay, we're possibly going to this future where perhaps, our skills are going to be vastly differently. I guess skills needed are probably going to be vastly different to what's needed today, assuming they're needed at all. And then you've got a bunch of students sitting in front of you, and very much thinking about, how should I be teaching differently? Like, how much am I preparing them? And like, obviously, the really short-term thing, which I'm thinking a lot about now, obviously, is ChatGPT, because it's got the large language models are suddenly now super easy to use. I've run all my exams from previous years through it and assignments and seen how it's gone. And, like, it probably failed, but it's still like it'd be a really useful tool for some students, because a lot of my students can't write, I'd say, like, they're pretty bit harshly, but they really struggle to write well, and I think it helped them. But it's this question, like, how much should my teaching be changing because of what's coming? Or should I just can I predict enough? And I was wondering, for the two of you, like, when you think about your teaching, like, if you're there going, actually 100%. I need to teach quite differently now.
100%. I actually think that all of the value of teaching in the future is going to be aimed towards helping people learn how to organize their own ideas. I mean, that's why writing is such a disaster right now for kids. I feel like is that there isn't that same attention placed on how to take an idea and lay it out and then interrogate it from the other side and then put together some decision essentially at the end of it. I mean, I don't know about your class, but I've like really moved away from just wrote exams and really try to work in more like project-based settings where people can, do presentations or make films or, I guess the occasional essay, something where they're actually being forced to tear an issue apart from different angles and come to a more holistic decision as a result of that. Because so so much of the education I experienced, especially coming up through science, and both of us really, was just, learn how this thing works, tell us how it works a month from now, and then forget about it, and then move on. But that's like you say, that's totally untenable today when you have Wikipedia. I can look up every math formula I need, right? I can, if someone throws some bizarre physics concept at me, well, okay, if I just spend a half an hour like on the internet, I can come to my senses about this, right? There's no need to have this catalog of information packed away. So what kind of changes are you making?
Well, I think the most basic one, I'm actually going to encourage students this year to use ChatGPT and other things as part of the exercise. And so I'll probably rewrite questions so that ChatGPT is unlikely to spit out something that would pass to begin with. But it's the sort of thing where it would give them some good guidance, and then they'd better think about it, look at it and go, okay, what parts is that it's doing are useful? Like it might actually write something, a part of it really well, but then they'll be able to interrogate, where's it going wrong? Where is its logic not quite right? Like to give one example I've been playing with a bit. So one of my subjects is a basic behavioral economics course. And so part of it we go, okay, here is the optimal way of making decisions on decisions about probability, so Bayesian updating, and then saying here's a few ways in which people tend to get that wrong. So confusing conditional probabilities, that kind of thing. But as part of the exercise, I go, well, let's solve a couple of Bayesian problems. Where say the classics. You've got a positive test for a disease. The base rate in the population is X. The false positive rate is Y. Solve it out. And ChatGPT tends to not quite get it right. There's nearly always a couple of errors. And so I guess I'm trying to craft questions like where I'm going, okay, how do I get something where ChatGPT puts something out interesting, but they've then got to work with it. They've still got to go change it, tweak it, get a little bit closer. So they're using the tool, but at the same time, they still need to understand the concepts behind it. Like I'm not quite sure what, I'm probably not going to skim basic Bayesian problems, but I'm crafting different things like that where it's like it's a useful tool, but it's a step short. And then on top of that, and this is probably, it's probably because I haven't been able to think far enough ahead. Like there probably will just be some questions where I go, that's beyond the technology now. Draw a diagram illustrating this. Record a 2-minute presentation with slides, sort of explaining it, and have a few things which just I guess again make them organize their ideas and give them to me. I
mean, one thing I really, really harp on in my own course is, as opposed to looking at the way things are, I try to find the pieces of, and really this is what we do on this show too in general. It's like kind of what we're obsessed with is like finding the edges of what's known and looking for the holes in the armor of what's known and really seeing, because when kids are coming up, a huge part of this is motivational, right? I mean, if they had the impression, as I did when I was in college, that, we basically understood how nature worked, the brain, we basically understand all these different things. We can fill in the details, maybe you go to grad school, do a PhD and study this one little thing and you'll like push it forward a little. But I think that's something of a disservice because in reality, there's huge holes in a lot of our paradigms actually. And so I try to like really orient my lectures anyways towards exciting kids about the fact that we actually not scare them like we know nothing, but hey, there's actually all these things which you probably think that we know everything about and we don't. And so, I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of motivating people towards problems that are actually going to be valuable in the future as well, that might not be obvious to the people who are writing the textbook from the past.
And in context of that, I think that the most useful thing that students can pick up is executive function. Like we know that that's something that can be trained, and we know that that's decisive in terms of being able to accomplish the things that you want to do. And I feel like education is not necessarily, especially at the higher levels, is not a process of teaching executive function. It's a process of testing executive function. And this struck me because we taught immunology of COVID for 2 years at this East Coast university remotely. And I was just struck where it seemed like a lot of the students didn't have a lot of executive function. Like they didn't know how to study. They didn't know how to approach the questions. They didn't know how to think. And there's a lot of ink that's been spilled over technological stagnation in the sciences and in technology. There was that big paper that came out recently. I don't know if you saw it, but it was that there's been this, I don't want to say exponential because that's qualifying too much. There's been a significant decline in disruptive papers and patents since like the 1950s or something. Okay. And I think that comes down to the way that we're taught, which is exactly what Shilo said, is you show up to a biology major and at no point do you have a course which is this is what science is and this is how the people who came up with scientific paradigm shifts did it.
Yeah.
Because that's not what you're going to be doing. Your job is not, it's all the way through to the PhD. Your job is not to shift the paradigm at any step of at any step of the process. Your job is to help someone who has a grant figure out how to produce research that will further their ability to get another grant.
And maybe, hopefully, discover something cool along the way, right?
Maybe, but
it hopefully, like just like economics, maybe it makes people happy too at the same time.
But
or something.
I think that it genuinely strikes a cold dread into the heart of most scientists at the darkest, quietest part of night when they think about discovering something truly new. Because we do not reward true novelty. Like, the entire process of science, if you show up and you're like, hey, I think that this foundational paradigm that we have given Nobel Prizes for is incorrect. Get out of here. Like there's not a round of applause that's waiting for you and everybody's like, thank you so much for pointing that out. That's really good of you. It's literally, you're going to be shouted down in every single room for the rest of your life.
Which is ironic because, Darwin experienced this, right? And, Galileo, and it's like every time there's a revolution, somebody has to get a scientific revolution, that somebody has to get martyred, it feels like.
Well, it's like someone the other day, I don't remember, I spend a tremendous amount of time scrolling Twitter, and sometimes I'm like, I should do that a lot less, but I get so much out of it because I've like curated the feed enough that people are always throwing interesting things out. And the other day, somebody was talking about the question of bravery. And they were like, we associate bravery as being a celebrated thing in our society. But in reality, if you're morally brave, what that means is that you are going against the grain of what everybody thinks is right. And that is a highly, tightly controlled situation where no one's going to like you. You're not going to have any friends as somebody who's actually the one who's out there and is like, no, I don't think that's right.
A small group of friends, perhaps.
A small group of friends, perhaps. But it's like, that's the hope. But I think that that's what you have to bake into students is a fearlessness, is a sense of mission for what it is that you're studying. You're not studying to become a cog in a software company. You could probably do that by yourself in front of your computer. Go ahead. Like that's available to you if you really want. But the spirit of education is at its heart, I think, the spirit of teaching not just how to think, but what to think about and how to stand up and how to make sure that your ideas are robust so that they actually can stand up and that you can actually build something out of them.
Or they're like aligned with what you want to be, where you want to, what you imagine as your greatest possible actuation.
You've recently started telling your students, I saw you sent me this, the interview that student did with you where, I think the last line was that she was like, what do you want students to learn? And you said, I want them to realize that the most important thing is being able to play well with others.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this hilarious myth in science, at least. I don't know if you see this in economics, that, there's these giants, like we have Einstein and Newton, right? But what's funny is when you really start to study the lives of these people, you realize they had these massive social networks, Absolutely. Einstein wasn't that great of a mathematician, but he had a best friend who was absolutely world-class, top of the shelf. And that's really what moves things forwards. And so I don't know.
Read Darwin's correspondence, and it's just amazing. The network he had, and the people who would send him ideas and data points, it was just absolutely amazing.
Yeah, do you see that in economics too?
So economics still definitely has a bit of a giant thing. In fact, behavioral economics too really has a thing about celebrity academics. But I think it is true. Like this economics, probably less so, but behavioral economics definitely is you're just seeing more authors on papers. You're seeing bigger collaborations. You're seeing more teamwork, and so there's definitely a lot more playing together. Well, the flip side is it's kind of interesting to know how much are there still these giant leaps that are being made? Are we are people in that new environment? Because again, one of my little critiques of behavioral economics is that a lot of the people I think are the best, brightest, most interesting behavioral economists, they kind of adopted a role a little bit more like technicians and or engineers than scientists. They're discovering, doing really important work around vaccine uptake and so on. But they're probably not the people generating, I guess really new innovative models of human behavior, sort of bringing together a lot of this stuff. So so it's kind of interesting that the countervailing trends of, I think it's much more collaborative sort of discipline, but perhaps doesn't have enough of the maybe it needs someone sort of well networked but locked away who's willing to be brave and throw something out there ready to be shot down.
You said at the beginning of this conversation that you left the business world to become an academic.
Yes.
Why? That's not a path that most people take.
Yeah, so a little bit of an accidental academic in some ways. So yes, I've been, I suppose, working in various roles in the workforce for 20 years. I was a lawyer to begin with, and then I realized that I wasn't that interested in what law is. I was far more interested in what it should be. So I thought economics was the pathway to that. So I equipped myself with economics, and I got into economics and went, hang on, I'm a little bit unsatisfied with this. Like, it feels very as if I want to know more about the foundations. So then I did a PhD combining combining evolutionary biology and economics. And so that's kind of, I guess, where most of my behavioral economic knowledge came from. And while I was doing that, I was working at PwC, I guess the big multinational, sort of in their consulting division, and just a friend of mine was started up a behavioral economics practice and worked at that for quite a number of years. And while I was doing that, I suppose because on the back of the PhD, I was built up a bit of an academic network. And actually at the time I finished a PhD, nosed around an academic career. And what became very clear is that Australian economics PhDs weren't really that appreciated, particularly in Australian universities. So at the time went, maybe an academic career wasn't even open to me, let alone of interest. But what sort of happened is, I suppose there's a new Master of Behavioral Economics where I'm teaching. Its first full year of operation is this year, and because of someone departing, I got an approach going, "Would you be interested in entering academia?" And I suppose at the time I went, let's give it a try. And that's kind of, it's always what I'm doing. I'm giving it a run, because I've heard many stories. In fact, I know many people who have gone the other way. I think it's almost like a standard thing, sort of that the tweet going, "I'm leaving academia for the outside world." So I guess suppose I see a lot of the failings of, or at least the perverse incentives of academia. But I give it a try. But I think I'm a little bit lucky in the way that I get to approach it, which is why I've decided to give it a go. I do like teaching, so I actually genuinely like teaching. I'm not bothered about teaching loads. The role I've got is slightly heavier teaching load than my colleagues, but I like it. I really enjoy the task of trying to craft material in a way that students will take it in, understand it, and really builds my understanding of it too. There's no substitute for getting across the areas from teaching them. But also just because I think I'm old and secure enough in my place in the world. Like I don't feel the pressure of that publish and perish sort of existence. Like I'm probably going to I'll publish a bit, but I don't feel like I'm holding on to my tenterhooks to the academic world. So I'm a little bit lucky there. It's pretty also the Australian university structure, and particularly in economics and business schools, it's just not pretty. The pressure and the volume of creation probably isn't quite what it is might be in say more scientific disciplines or in the US. I'm probably a little bit sheltered there. So I'm actually going to spend a lot more time, and I've been focusing on teaching so far. But I'm going to spend a lot more time doing popular writing, like writing the sort of essay, writing long form essays. There's some really nice publications out there. I think, we cross paths through. I wrote an article in Works in Progress magazine around, I guess, the need for less biases in behavioral economics. I've written a bit, not so much the last year or two, for behavioral scientists, which is a really nice online publication. And so I hope to do more of that and finding different ways of communicating the interesting ideas that are in this space. I find that a lot of fun. And I guess we'll see where it leads. Like, it's one of those things where ultimately, if academia doesn't quite pan out, I guess there's plenty of other interesting things happening out there. But I'm pretty optimistic. I've got good colleagues. It's a nice university. I'm hopeful.
Yeah, and you're setting a pretty cool example for your students too. Having explored all these different regions and succeeded in each of them, but been able to move fluidly back and forth. I think that's probably a really healthy model for how to encounter change as the world shifts around you or your preferences shift, like how you would adopt new ways of being. I think that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
I love also that you're one of the few people who's made me feel lazy. I listened to your life story and all these you go and become a lawyer, and then you do the PhD economics and industry job, and now you're a professor and leading up this new initiative. It's pretty awesome. That's a lot. You've accomplished a lot so far.
Yeah, I don't know. It's one of the things I think you do things and time passes. I quite often have conversations with prospective students around, who think about coming to the masters, and they're there and they'll be in their late 20s and early 30s, and they're going, "Oh, I don't know. It's maybe too late. I don't know if I could do this." I'm like, truth, I didn't even start looking at economics till I was 30. So it's one of those things where it's never too late to pick up new things and have a go. It's like kind of, I think. Maybe I'm wrong, but I at least feel that there's a lot less stigma from being an older novice in a lot of fields now. You can go in there, learn it, and make if you're a good, I guess either productive employee or coming up with interesting ideas. I think there's a lot of space for you, even if you're not the bright-eyed 21-year-old that they're used to.
There's just so much information available for free to people too. It's like, it's never, I mean, if you have the motivation, if you're sufficiently well motivated, there really doesn't seem to be a lot that can hold you back in terms of at least getting yourself out to the playing field with the proper equipment.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah, there's a lot of fields now. You can basically do, get yourself a university equivalent education online for free. In fact, from the best universities in the world. Like, it's pretty amazing. When I was, one of the roles I had was more of a data science role. And I just remember that the applicants who would apply, and then they'd all have done a dozen Coursera things, and they'd be up on the Kaggle rankings, which is like an online competition for, I guess, machine learning, I guess trying to solve very different problems. And it was all just off their own back, and just their level of technical expertise was amazing. And zero university training in that particular field, but it was really, really nice. And you look at those people, you go, wow, you're that focused on building your own skill set. You're going, when you can't come in and look at some of my problems, because if you've got that way of approaching the world, you're going to do pretty well anywhere.
Yeah, I feel like young people have this tremendous amount of energy. Like, there's so much.
Said like a true old person.
I mean, yeah, maybe I'm just, I admittedly must be getting old, but I think it's beautiful, but I think it also has led to a lot of the anxieties too, because if that really hot wire isn't plugged into something, then it just sits there and cooks itself. And I feel like there's a lot of that ungrounded electricity as well amongst the students too, and so like there's certainly a huge service to helping people find where they want to plug in exactly.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've been talking for a while, and I have a closing question. Are there things that you still have to ask?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so you're sitting at the helm of this new program, and you have a wealth of experience in a lot of different fields. You've come to it with a sense of what works and what doesn't. And now you have in front of you kind of some raw materials to play with. And so if everything works out the way that you imagine it, what will you build?
Yes, well, in some ways I'm trying to build in some ways a bit of a pipeline of people. That's kind of what it is, a pipeline of people with I think with a bunch of characteristics. So even though the master of behavioral economics, like it's framed around a particular subject area, behavioral economics, but what I really hope is they come out of it with an ability to, or at least a desire to, really just grapple with science in general. Because behavioral economics is it's an experimental science. There's a lot of theory about it, but most papers sort of have really cool experiments in it, and having the ability just to take things like that and read them, think about them, critique them, and contemplate. Does this should this change the way that I think about the world? But then after to do that, instead of just telling stories about it, is then to go out and think about ways, well, how can I really, is this a tool I can use? And not only is it a tool I can use, how could I, when I take this out there and use it, how can I really test it and understand if it's working in the way I want? And so that's kind of like the skill set part. That's really the dream. And so I think some of this, like a lot of students want to work in behavioral economics. That's why they've come and joined. But, there's just so many domains where that skill set's useful, the ability to go through a really messy science and find interesting pieces. But the other thing which I really want, sort of, I guess the other feature of this pipeline is really, I'm not sure if it's the right word, but really humble people. Because, as you've heard, I guess, in conversation, I've got a bit of a critique about the way that we think about these problems around whether we're properly understanding people's objectives and the way they're going about it. The question of whether it's right for us to be doing, I guess, manipulating people in certain ways, or whether we're truly leading to better outcomes for them. So it's to really have a deep humility about that, so that then we're far less, so that when they're attacking these problems, they're willing to one believe they're wrong, but also to really spend a lot of time to think about, is this really a problem? Is this really something I should be solving? Am I going to actually, shift the lever? Because ultimately, I actually think there is space. I sound pretty negative sometimes when I'm talking about behavioral economics, and I critique it a lot. But I think there is actually this really good space where people can actually really help people make decisions that lead to their lives being better in whatever dimension it is, by whether it being through nudges or other means. And so. But so with the right mindset, I think, and just being willing to accept sometimes you're wrong, sometimes the bias isn't what we think it is. Sometimes they're not making an error. You can then find those edges where actually, no, that person could really do with our help. That's where we can make a difference. We can make their life better, and let's do it.
I love that, and I also, you've given me some really interesting ideas to chew on too. I know I'll be thinking about some of these things in the coming days, particularly. How just this idea of growth as encompassing other things besides just dollars, how that can play out in the future. And anyways, I thank you for that, and thanks for taking the time out. I know you're an extremely busy dude, so thanks for taking the time out of your day to speak with us and school us on some of these ideas. We're very new to economics, so thank you for giving us our very first full-scale introduction to the art form.
Well, technically, we had a dead galore.
That's true. But he was more of a general theory of nature kind of guy.
That is true. He had a theory of everything, which I think that this is less of a theory of everything.
Indeed. I think in the previous conversation, he was one of my thesis examiners. So
that's right.
So we have a connection there. So he's got some really amazing work.
Yeah, thank you so much.
But thank you very much for the invite. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Excellent.
Cool, man. Well, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you down the line.
Okay, you too. Catch you later.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.